Hey, welcome to Select Arcane. I'm here today with Diana Macdonald to talk about Generation 1 hobby history. So this is from 1950 to 1979. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you, Andrea. Who I am, I've been a long-time horse person, third generation horse person. Got my first Breyer model, this is her, in 1976 when I was 10 years old. Had my first three for a few years, didn't do anything hobby-wise. We made our own tack, our own blankets, chain-stitched harness. Didn't really know about the hobby. We were on a farm in middle rural Ontario, kind of isolated, not very wealthy. And then come 2016, a friend of mine, through showing horses, actually had a dealership and started buying more models. Got a crash course, and now I'm doing pretty much everything. Showing, judging, photo shows, live shows, just customized my first doll. Not into customizing horses yet, but I certainly make tack.
Our focus is on Canadian model horse history, but with that you can't ignore its American foundation and the other historical international influences that pushed Breyer to create their first model. Horses have been depicted in sculpture since at least 35,000 years ago with the Vogelherd horse in southern Germany, and from there you can trace the love of equine sculpture throughout history worldwide. And then we turn to more modern history, such as equine sport, polo, racing, the start of the cowboy era, as well as the World Wars.
With the World War coming in, World War I, we saw a decimation of the population in Europe, not so much in America, but people coming home from the wars didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have a lot of industry. We ended up with the Great Depression, which emasculated the population. They just could not function with no money or stuff like that. So any of your plastic molding companies were all of a sudden making walkie-talkies and steering wheels for Jeeps and all sorts of wartime necessities. And so post-World War II, you saw the people coming back, and all of a sudden they're having to find jobs and make jobs, and they're turning into making now telephones, household items. And then eventually by about 1950, they're starting to make some luxury goods again, including toys. So the imagination went to the American West, where you had freedom, you had self-reliance, you had the ability to be a self-made person. And from there, you've got the whole spawning of the Western magazines, the Western art, the Western culture in its various forms. Post-World War II, you've got people coming back and looking for industries. But if we back up even further to post-World War I, you have a bunch of veterans coming back to the U.S. They don't know what to do with themselves, and they decide they want to make things like medals and trophies and class rings and championship rings. And that was the start of the Dodge Trophy Company. Dodge made all sorts of things, from flatware to medals to the Oscar trophies, the Emmy trophies. And then they expanded. They were talking to Gladys Brown Edwards, who worked for the Kellogg Ranch in California, and she was sculpting and drawing horses, and they commissioned her to create sculptures for their trophies. So you move on a little further, and they're the premier trophy company, but you've got some of the plastic companies wanting to make something similar for less money, better value. So you've got the rise of things like the Breyer Molding Company, the Heartland Plastic Company, and things like that. So they started doing all sorts of things like clocks for the Mastercraft Clock Company, who then was commissioned by Woolworth to create for the Woolworth Company a horse clock, very similar to the Dodge metal clock, which had a Western style horse either over or beside the clock. Master crafters originally were using the Heartland Champ and Victor models, and then they, instead of getting the models out of Tennessee, they decided to go round the corner, just the next block, to Breyer Molding Company and says, can you make us one of these? We've got this order for a couple of thousand for Woolworths. So Breyer Molding Company did that, but master crafters couldn't afford to pay for the whole mold, so Breyer was allowed to use the mold as part payment on creation to have a standalone horse. And that's where we got our Western horse from. And it came in 2 sizes, and all of a sudden you've got Breyer Animal Division forming because you've got a mass market of people phoning and writing in and going, where do we get this horse? I just want the horse. I don't want the clock. I just want the horse. And you've got anything else other than the horse? What have we got? You know, so you've got that all starting, and from there, the industry took off.
So during Generation 1, there were actually multiple companies in existence before Breyer even became a thing. You had the Marx Johnny West Company, you had Beswick started in the 1800s, you had Northlight in 78, you had Heagen-Reneker, Heartlands, Barbie entered with their first horse, you have Schleich in Germany, Julep in the UK, and the Made in Japans, which were all over the place. This isn't to say that there weren't model horse collectors before the big boom of Breyer. Pre-Breyer, you had Heartland and Beswick, but the model horse hobby in itself did not start until the 60s, where you actually had people getting together, trading, and building off of each other. Diana mentioned that Gladys Brown Edwards was originally hired by the Dodge Trophy Company to sculpt a horse for the Master Crafter's clock. This horse originally went by 2 names when it was still produced under the Heartland Molding Company out of Heartland, Wisconsin, Champ when it was produced as a Palomino, and Victor when it was produced in Alabaster. But before Gladys, the Heartland Molding Company was already in production. They started in the 1940s, almost a full decade earlier than Breyer, and were already producing plastic horses. However, other than Gladys, none of the early artists who worked on the first horses are given recognition to sculpting them. However, probably the most famous model horse artist of those early days is Christian Hess. Better known as Chris, he was essentially with Breyer since 1953. Some credit him as the original sculptor of the Western horse, but this is not factual. Chris sculpted over 100 horses for Breyer, mostly during Generation 1 and a little bit through Generation 2. Virtually all Breyers, with some exceptions, were sculpted by Chris between the 1950s to mid-1970s. However, nearly equally revered was another artist, Maureen Love, who worked for the Heagen-Reneker Company since the early 1950s. Heagen-Reneker was an American ceramics producer who created animal figurines. While Beswick's were more realistic in nature, Heagen-Reneker's had a beautiful stylistic quality to them, and that style can be attributed to Maureen. In the 70s, Heagen-Reneker had a rocky road to success. Multiple different factors forced the factory to close down temporarily, which forced Maureen to freelance. And that's where she came to Breyer. As a temporary artisan, Maureen is credited for creating multiple favorite Generation 1 horses, such as the Proud Arabian family, and is credited with starting the classic or freedom scale models. At multiple points in time, Breyer purchased the rights to Maureen's sculptures, and even though they were previously produced by Heartland, transitioned over to Breyer.
So the early movers and the shakers in the collector hobby were Americans. You've got Ellen Hitchens, Simone Smiljanek, pardon my French, Linda Walter, and Marney Welarius. And because of these people, that's how we got Canadians into it. So Marney wrote an article March 1969 in the Western Horseman. Bobbie Mossiman read that, wrote to Marney, got a response, and meanwhile, through pen pal in the back of Western Horseman were Val Hargreaves and Andrea Pratt, writing to each other, got connected, found out they loved model horses together. And in fact, I remember those pen pal things. It's like, hi, my name's so-and-so, I'm X number of years old, and these are my hobbies. You know?
That would so not fly today.
That would not fly today, but it flew back then, and I can remember that, and I probably had a pen pal or two through that. So anyways, all of a sudden there's this enclave of people down the Niagara region in Ontario. So we've got about 6 to 8 people down the Niagara region. And I mean, some of those people are still in the hobby today.
Joining the Ontario Hobby Group in 1971 was Beth Peart, connecting with Linda Walters through the Western Horseman. These early pioneers had no means of communication except for snail mail, as in the early 70s, the internet simply did not exist yet.
They're finding it difficult to get the money orders, the postal stamps, sending off photos down to these American horse photo shows in a timely manner, and getting the results back and getting the photos back in order to send them to the next show the next month. That was getting a challenge. And I mean, some of the shows were as far away as Alabama. So what they decided was, let's form our own Canadian club and a newsletter. So this intrepid group, all of a sudden in 1973, in somebody's back office with a mum with the ability to photocopy, they're creating a Canadian newsletter. Within a year, they're up to a dozen members from this core group of about 6. Well, from there it spread. Andrea moved out west, and then eventually you've got Val moving out west, but meanwhile somebody's cousin down in the Maritimes starts the Maritime group, and all of a sudden you've got this build of momentum happening in Canada for Canadians. But you've got movers and shakers like, again, Beth, going down to the States, picking up, getting on a plane, and going to the Model Horse Congress, and getting picked up by Kathy Wells and Marney Welarius in 1977 with 14 ponies in her suitcase, going. And then 2 years later, her mom going with her. I mean, there were no big shows up here, nothing recognized until you get to the early to mid 80s. Everything was done stateside, other than we had some photo shows. The Canadian Model Horse and Club and Registry started 73, 74, and we have photos of some of those early horses.
So through research, we pinpointed that the first province to actually initiate the model horse hobby was Alberta through Barbie, which means that number 2 was Ontario through the Model Horse Collection Group that Diana just mentioned, and number 3 was the Maritimes. Do we know exactly what province that was?
It would need New Brunswick with Eleanor O'Brien.
And then the other provinces followed a lot later.
So when we talk about plastics, in 1929, the Eastman Kodak Company in Tennessee Eastman Division, wanted to create a plastic center or reel for their home videos. And from that, they then worked out, through several different formulations, a cellulose acetate, originally made from a softwood pulp, and eventually into the oils and other chemicals to get a more stable compound. And that compound is called tennite. Tennite is what is primarily used to make model horses, such as the Breyer model horses. So when we look at how the industries are all connected, so the early innovations of the film industry, the photographic and home film industry, has rolled into a trademark and a patent which is available worldwide for creation of things like your Bakelite, jewelry and cookware, and into your Tenite, which is plastic that we know and love today in our model horses. So in the early 1970s, there was an oil crisis, and that oil crisis affected the availability of the oil that went into making the cellulose acetate, or the Tenite, and so therefore all the plastic molding companies had to figure out a way of still getting their product out there, their models out there, but doing it more economically. And how did they do this? Well, they started using in some cheaper plastics, some cruder oil, not the more refined stuff, and from that you got the rise of the chalkies and even the streakies. And it was all due to that oil crisis that happened with the OPEC companies in the early 70s. It resolved itself, but by that time Breyer had refined their processes, didn't need to go back to the full oil, highly refined oil. They could use some of the cheaper blends, and that's why you'll find a difference in the quality of the plastic and the models themselves. Also, labor started becoming an issue. How are we going to get more Americans to make these products? We just can't churn them out, and it's getting too expensive. So Breyer decides it's going to try and move the operation to Mexico. Build a plant or rented a plant down there, sent down three molds for test runs, one being the El Pastor mold, one being a donkey, and I think the Fighting Stallion was the third. I might be wrong on that one. But they send them down. Well, they have production issues. They have labor issues. And in fact, there's a labor strike. So they're getting limited molds back. The donkey mold ended up with some damage. So Breyer pulls everything back to North America, back into the U.S. So Breyer, to get the models out to the general public, originally started selling directly to retail stores through dealer catalogs, and then all of a sudden they got, I guess at one of the trade fairs, Montgomery Ward, Sears Roebuck, which was Sears back then, they got involved and started selling models. It was the regular run models, like the running horse mare, the running mare. It went through several changes, and then it got to be they were having special runs specifically for that catalog.
And then later on, the model changed that people were able to become vendors and distributors by purchasing a certain amount of models and selling them through their own retail chain, either their own tack store or their own store in general that sold model horses. Eventually, these models went to public retailer. New York Toy Fair became a big hub of showing off new products for the season, what's going to be hot and what's not going to be hot. And buyers, who are the people who circle and are in charge of what goes into your stores, such as Hudson's Bay, Canadian Tire, or any other store. Every store has a buyer, and they will go to these toy fairs, such as the one in New York, and choose what they want to put into the store.
So Breyer advertised itself in its own marketing materials as in dealer catalogs as not just a toy, it's a gift, it's a collectible art object. It's much more. People assumed that, or thought that, collectors only collected electric trains or planes, not horses or horse-shaped objects. The Beswicks, people had them custom colored to match their best racehorses or their best hunters and things like that. So all of a sudden we're getting some mass-produced horses in the plastic Tenite that originally started to be children's toys, but now has moved up to people getting older. They're wanting to collect them. They're wanting to go, get one of everything. And originally it was just limited colors. You had 2 or 3 different colorways, and then the more colors and the more markings added, the more people wanted to collect. So the question is, what did these Breyers cost in the beginning? Well, in the 50s, you were buying them for $2.50 a piece.
Still expensive for the time.
That was very expensive for the time. Roll into the, 60s, you're paying about $6 a model now. And roll into the 70s, you're paying anywhere from about $8 to $12, depending upon whether it's an older model, older mold, or a new one. The late 60s, they brought out some of the decorator colors. That fell flat. Whether it was a shock to the collectors who were looking to get more realistic type models or what, don't know. It fell flat after about a 6 to 12 month reign. Whereas the wood grain actually took off. People liked the wood grain. They first probably saw it in, not only as standalone models, but it was coming in on a plinth or as a lamp, and the wood grains have carried on through. And whereas the decorators died until 2000 when they brought it back as a Breyer Fest model on the Misty mold.
We'll discuss that in Generation 3. And as these collections grew and hobbyists grew in numbers, we started getting a lot of get-togethers. By the way, this is still all happening in the US, mostly focused in California and Michigan, where you have a rise of not only collectors, but these backyard get-togethers like events, photo shows, and newsletters.
1967, Breyer did its very first portrait model. It came out with Man o' War. Famous racehorse. If you haven't heard of Man o' War, you need to go back to school. And the following year, Adios came out. After that, more and more portrait models, individual horses, famous horses, primarily starting with what you saw on TV. Fury, Prancer, but these were a little more refined than that early Fury Prancer, but we're talking really nice models.
Basically a throwback to what Beswick used to do in the 1800s.
Yes, where they customized to your horse on the colorways. But yeah, exactly like that. Customizing to your horse. So customizing back in that Generation 1 was rehairing, repositioning, repainting. And they weren't really known as customs. They were RRRs. I don't know whether or not they had actual classes for them, separate from the regular models. That's something I have to look into.
But what is very interesting, that original finish also included horses that you may have added to. For example, you've added a star or added a sock. That was still okay in showing original finish, which today would be absolutely out of the question. But Generation 1 had not quite ironed out those details about show rules just as of yet.
Showing is usually done by mailing photos to horse shows throughout the country and having them judged. A lot more effort and preparation is needed for these in-person shows.
Most people had access to your little Brownie cameras, your Kodak Instamatics, a similar vein. Well, all of a sudden 35mm cameras came out, and boy was there a controversy in the newsletters out there. Oh my goodness, there were judges who were swearing up and down they would not place a photo of a horse unless it was done on 35mm. Whereas there were other people swearing up and down it didn't really matter, and we're going to stick with our old photos. But the weird thing about photo showing back then, you could mail your model out to somebody with your dolls and your setup. They would take the professional photos for you. Can you imagine shipping out your horse out for professional photos? Not done in today's world. But you had people who had 35 mils who knew exactly the right distance to get the right focal length and all the setup and lighting and all that. So they were doing awesome. And believe it or not, this controversy has come up on photos more recently too. But, back then it was just all about getting the right photos. You could also, if you had a really good photo, you could sell copies of that photo, and you could show with a photo of my mold. Didn't matter if you owned the model or not. You could just rename it, and all of a sudden you've got my photo being used. It just depended upon permissions and things like that. So not only did you have to pose your model, set up your camera, and take the photo, but that photo was done on film. So then you had to take it to somewhere to get it developed, or send it away.
Or develop it yourself with multiple chemical baths.
Yes, people had dark rooms at that point in time, under the red light, the whole 9 yards. And the thing was, it was all a guessing game. You were not 100% guaranteed that what you saw in that viewfinder was actually what you were going to get. It could be blurry and out of focus. And yes, some people showed those shows because they just didn't have anything better.
And just so you kind of get the perspective, when you look at some of these old customs from that era today, they're not necessarily meant for in-person looking. They're mostly geared towards the photography of the time. So when you look at a piece by Beth and you look at that grainy black and white photo, that horse looks so realistic because the paint job, the herring, the tack is all centered around that photography, because that horse was a photo show horse. And now you have more in-person shows, better photography, digital, and the artistry has changed.
When we talk about things in photography and doing your performance setups, what do you do about a doll? Well, in the late 50s, Heartland and Breyer both came out with a rigid rider doll. These came on their Fury Prancer, sort of things. So you had Davy Crockett, you had the Mountie, you had, Tom Minks or whatever star you had that was Western Star or icon like the Mountie was out there. And so you had fixed ones. So they came in, Jane West and things like that. They came fixed. So you would change them out on your horses. Sometimes the saddles were fixed to the Western horse. Sometimes they weren't. English saddles, Western saddles, changes in reins, changes in medallions on the fixed molded on bridles. Things changed back and forth. There wasn't really any doll out there other than these fixed rider dolls. That's where we got the rise of performance without dolls.
So how do Canadians fit into the rider narrative?
Well, then we come back out to 77, 79. Beth Peart was down at the Model Horse Congress, and she got talking to Peter Stone because she had made herself a doll. Well, he picked her brain for a couple of hours, and Beth will have to tell the true story. And then 6 months later, all of a sudden comes out a prototype doll named Brenda Breyer. And almost basically a replica of what Beth had innovated on her own.
So this has never been confirmed, but it has been speculated a lot. And this is some information that we felt was important to share, because at the time, between the 1950s and late 70s, you have a lot of hidden information, misinformation, and the fact that some contributions were swept aside, whether it was gender-based or money-based or racial-based, we thought that it would be important to bring up these stories as well.
And it's not to say that Breyer didn't have a prototype doll already in the works. It was just very suspicious. Why are we giving credit in some areas and not in other?
So could it be safe to assume that Brenda Breyer actually is Canadian? Maybe carries a Canadian passport.
She could very well be. Nobody knows for sure. Those records aren't available to the public. From there, you've got people like Marney Welarius, who 1969 started having backyard shows or living room shows, and a couple of years later, in 71, 72, is starting to have a bigger show.
Here's Marney Welarius, the organizer of these annual gatherings, to talk about the event.
The hobby itself has grown extremely in the last 20 years, because 20 years ago this type of thing did not exist. It has developed since to model correspondence through the mail during the year, and the idea of live shows and Congress, of course, is to get them together so that they are meeting one another and no longer just foreign through the mail. And the information you're about to see in the videotape will bring you through and show you how the people have developed this hobby. Many of the particular participants have originally shown or exhibited a horse interest at a young age, received a gift of one of these model horses, which has either made the interest in horses growing to the point that they research live horses and get into live horses as well, or they are in model horses still, using their artistic talent as well as their knowledge to learn correct breeding, tack, harnessry, art, any other of the related things that could go along with this hobby, as in HO railroading.
You're going from the early 60s with all the newsletters, which is everybody, starting them in the US. There are about 5 or 6 at that point in time, to your backyard shows, to organized shows that are starting to become national and international when you start thinking about it. And this is when everybody had to do everything through finding out information in the Western Horseman and the pen pal pages and the ad pages, to everything being done by snail mail. I mean, Canadians, if they wanted to participate, had to get money orders or American cash. They had to get American stamps, which trying to get them at a Canadian post office would have been virtually impossible. And, trying to get your entries in a timely manner. I mean, the snail mail back then was impossible. It would take, a week for a letter to get, a 2-hour drive one direction. It would take 2 days coming back. It was just impossible back then.
The hobbyists who started their hobby careers in Generation 1 were the true pioneers of the hobby. From unreliable postal service to pre-internet to paving the way for customs and later on resins, we as modern hobbyists have a lot to be thankful for. If you're interested in more model horse history and want to see Generation 2, 1980 to 1999, subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram @SelectArcane or on Facebook by the same name. And thank you so much to Diana Macdonald, our local model horse historian, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.